to The Catholic Perspective, a podcast brought to you by rcspirituality.org. Enjoy the episode.
Some straight talk about the human embryo.
John Smith is a longtime member of American Atheists, Inc. John Smith is not his real name, but he is a real person, and American Atheists, Inc. is a real organization. At his 25th high school reunion, he ran into an old friend whom he hadn't seen in a long time, whose son, Mike, was also at the reunion. He happened to be a recently ordained Catholic priest. John Smith and Father Mike got to talking. They went through a lot of the typical discussions. How can you believe in God when 75% of scientists are atheists? How can you believe in God when religion has caused so much tragedy and misery throughout history, etc., etc.? After a while, the conversation turned towards moral issues, and eventually to abortion. John Smith explained that he was anti-abortion, but he was pro-RU486. That's the famous abortion pill, a pharmaceutical that induces a non-surgical abortion in the earliest stages of pregnancy by tricking the mother's body into thinking it's not pregnant, so that it will follow its normal menstrual cycle, even though an embryo has implanted itself in the uterus. Father Mike was a bit confused as to why John Smith was anti-abortion, but pro-RU486. Don't they amount to the same thing? He queried. No, not really, John Smith answered. When you abort a fetus, he explained, you can actually see the body parts and everything. But when you abort an embryo, well, it's so small that it doesn't really count. Father Mike was tongue-tied in the face of such devastating logic. John Smith was definitely right about the small size of the human embryo. In fact, the human zygote, the cell that results from the fertilization of an oocyte, or egg cell, by a sperm at conception, is small enough to fit inside the period at the end of the sentence. To consider something so small as equal in importance to a developed fetus or a newborn baby, well, that would be somewhat counterintuitive, which is probably why so many people share John's opinion that the tiny little embryo is hardly worth worrying about. It's simply too small to be a human being. That opinion, however, is not shared by the Catholic Church. Why not? Why has the Church clearly and repeatedly declared that the human embryo should be treated with the same respect due to every human individual? The answer is simple. Because of the overwhelming scientific evidence offered by recent progress in embryology and genetics. The data gathered from this progress shows that the embryo, from the moment of conception, is a human individual, even if it doesn't look like it. It's human because it has a human genome, not a rat genome or a pig genome, which, by the way, is why scientists are so interested in harvesting human embryonic stem cells. If the embryo weren't human, its stem cells wouldn't be so valuable. And it's an individual because it shows the 4 key characteristics that qualify it as one: uniqueness, unity, autonomy, and continuity. First, the embryo is unique. It is something new. Its genetic program is different from those of its parents, and this gives rise to different physical characteristics. And even in the case of cloning, where the genetic program could be substantially the same as someone else's, the embryo would still be a separate individual because it has begun its own new cycle of life. A sperm cell has a lifespan of about 3 days. An oocyte or egg cell has a lifespan of about 1 day. But put them together to get a zygote, an embryo, and you get an organism with its own lifespan that can extend up to 80 years and beyond. It's a new, unique thing. Second, in addition to being a new thing, the embryo is also a unified thing. It's an organism, an organized grouping of elements that function together as a whole. As the one-celled zygote divides and expands, the new cells act together in a coordinated way right from the beginning. For example, the axis of the first division always forms at the juncture where the sperm penetrated the oocyte. And in the second division, when 2 cells become 4 cells, the first cell to divide waits, as it were, for the second cell to divide before continuing further divisions. And as the number of cells increases, they begin to gather at opposite poles of the embryo, taking their places for future specialization. All these phenomena and many more indicate that this bunch of cells, as some would call the embryo, is actually a unified organism. If you put a bunch of sperm cells together in vitro, they don't act like this. If you put a bunch of oocytes together in vitro, they don't act like this. If you put a bunch of amoebas together in vitro, they don't act like this. They act like, well, like a bunch of cells. But the embryo, from the beginning, shows a unified, progressive, organized development. And that brings us to the third indication that the human embryo is in fact a human individual. It's autonomy. When scientists put embryos under their laboratory lights, the embryos keep growing. So much so, in fact, that they have to be frozen in order to keep the growth under control. So it's not the mother or the laboratory technician who is giving impetus to the embryo's development. It's the embryo itself. Just give it the right food and shelter, and it will run its course. It's an autonomous organism. While it's developing in its mother's womb, for instance, it sends hormones into the mother's bloodstream, like HCG, which instructs the mother's body to keep producing progesterone so that menstruation won't sweep the embryo away. Or like SPI, which makes a diplomatic agreement with the mother's immune system, convincing it that the embryo is not a virus, not an enemy intruder that needs to be disposed of. Without this hormone, in fact, the mother's immune system would attack the embryo as a foreign invader, which is further evidence of its autonomy. At the same time, the embryo is brilliantly organizing its own development, sending some cells off to become the placenta, sending others off to begin assembling specialized structures like the cornea and the heart, and bringing others together to form what's called the primitive streak, the first nerve center. How do all these cells know where to go? How do they decide to transform into just the right type of tissue in just the right place? It's because the embryo is an autonomous organism directing and coordinating its own development through its own genetic code. This whole process occurs in a continuous fashion, which is the fourth indication that we are in the presence of an individual. There are only two non-continuous moments in the life cycle of the human individual: conception and death. Everything that happens in between happens gradually, one thing connected to the next, without jumps or breaks. The fetus who first develops fingers has the same fingerprints as the 18-year-old who joins the Marines. And those fingers began as a gathering of cells under the direction of other cells that were developed by the embryo in an earlier stage of development, and so on. You are 21 years old now because 21 years and 9 months ago you were conceived. That's where the process began. Before that moment, you, as a biological organism, did not exist. After that moment, you did. Of course, the fact that the embryo from its very first stage of development is unique, unified, autonomous, and continuous doesn't change the other fact that it is extremely small. And that extreme smallness, we have to admit, still makes it counterintuitive to say that the embryo is already a human individual. That's why it's nice to have all this scientific data. Science can help us counter our intuition when we need to. After all, it's also counterintuitive to say that the Earth goes around the sun, but it's still true. Some people, however, interpret the data differently, coming up with 3 common arguments to say that the human embryo is not a human individual. For instance, they point out that an embryo in its earliest stages can divide up and become twins, 2 individuals. So it couldn't have previously been its own individual. It must have just been some biological material looking for its identity. After all, how can an individual divide up into 2? Well, it actually happens all the time. Cut a branch off a rose bush in Moscow, plant it in the ground in San Francisco, and watch that branch become a new rose bush. Watch an amoeba swim around under your microscope, and sooner or later you'll see it divide up into 2 separate amoebas. To be an individual, you don't have to be undividable, you just have to be undivided. So the fact that an embryo in its earliest stages can give rise to another embryo doesn't show that it's not an individual, it just shows how powerfully alive its cells are during that initial stage. That immense power of the first embryonic cells is the basis of the second argument against the embryo's status as an individual human organism. The first embryonic cells are called totipotential stem cells. That means that they have the potential to become any kind of cell that the organism may need. Therefore, the argument goes, when an embryo consists exclusively of totipotential stem cells, you can't possibly consider it an individual. It's just a bunch of powerful, shapeless, directionless biological material waiting for instructions. The problem with this argument is that even though individually each cell is totipotential and therefore indeterminate, together they act like a team, harmoniously following a unified process of development, as we have seen. They're like a bunch of popsicle sticks strewn on your desk, shapeless, formless, meaningless in and of themselves. But you go away for an hour or two, and when you come back, there they are, all nicely arranged to spell the words, "Here I come." Only some organizational force could have worked that transformation. Shapeless cells arranged in a definite shape, formless stem cells working together to develop the immensely complex form of the human body. The phenomenon of totipotentiality, far from indicating the absence of an individual organism, is one of the great indicators of organization. Finally, other scientists claim that we don't really have an individual human organism until after a couple weeks, when the so-called primitive streak has been formed, because the primitive streak is the first version of the central nervous system, and you can't have an individual human organism without a central nervous system. But as we have seen, the development of the primitive streak itself indicates a prior coordination, that of the genome. When the nervous system is sufficiently developed, it will take over a lot of the coordination, but it itself didn't come into existence instantaneously. It arose in the continuous process of the embryo's growth. But even if someone remains in doubt about whether or not an embryo is a human individual, that in itself should be cause for care and caution. If you're hunting in the woods and you see something move, but you're not sure whether it's a deer or your hunting partner, you should wait for positive identification before you start shooting. The evidence of embryology and genetics is clear. The human embryo is an individual human organism. The Church, therefore, reminds us that we should treat human embryos with the dignity and respect that every individual human person deserves. John Smith may still shake his head and say, "But it's so small." And when he does, we can wholeheartedly agree, marveling at the wonders of God's creation as we admire our tiny little brothers and sisters who are just beginning the glorious adventure of life. And that's some straight talk about the human embryo.
You have been listening to The Catholic Perspective, a resource from rcspirituality.org. Please visit our website and check out more great resources to help you pray, learn, grow, and go. Please join our team of digital missionaries by subscribing at rcspirituality.org.